Dawn hadn't even broken clean across the hills when I stepped into my lower pasture, boots expecting mud and finding something worse. 6 straight days of spring rain should have left the ground soft. Instead, I was staring at a shallow inland sea swallowing half my field. The grass was flattened beneath a slick gray sheet of water streaked with an oily sheen. Cigarette butts and plastic wrappers floated past like driftwood. My horses were crowded tight against the fence line, restless, snorting at water that didn't belong there. And the worst part? It was creeping toward my father's red barn, the one I rebuilt board by board after he passed, the one that carried more of him than anything else I owned. I followed the fence along the retaining wall behind my property, the wall that marks the edge of Ridge Hollow Estates. Halfway down, I saw it. A brand new concrete storm pipe punched straight through the stone, jutting out like a rifle barrel aimed at my pasture. Water blasted from it with force, gouging a trench into my soil. Headlights flared at my gate. Marlene Whitaker and Blake Carrington stepped out, calm as accountants. "Natural drainage," Marlene said. "It's engineered theft," I answered. "It has to go somewhere." I looked at my drowning land and understood. They had chosen me. That was the moment I decided if they wanted somewhere for their water to go, I'd give it back to them. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to Fenceline File Stories. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? My name is Owen Carter, and until Ridge Hollow Estates decided my land was convenient, my life was simple in the best way a life can be. I live in the Tennessee foothills, where the mornings come in slow over the ridgeline, and the fog settles low in the valleys before the sun burns it off. My father bought this property when I was a kid. After he passed, it came to me, not as a prize, but as a responsibility. The pasture, the split-rail fences, the red barn with its tin roof that sings when it rains. I rebuilt half of it with my own hands. New beams. Reinforced foundation. Fresh paint, the exact shade he liked. It isn't fancy land. It's honest land. A few horses. A gravel drive. Quiet. For years, nothing behind my back fence but woods and wind. Then, about 5 years ago, the bulldozer showed up. Trees came down in long, echoing crashes. Within months, Ridge Hollow Estates rose on the ridge above me. A gated subdivision with brick pillars, decorative iron fencing, and a sign out front promising elevated living. Elevated was right. They sat higher than me in more ways than one. The HOA made itself known fast. Uniform mailboxes. Lawn height regulations. Exterior paint palettes pre-approved in something called Ridge Harmony Neutrals. They held wine socials and posted minutes from meetings about preserving community standards. I didn't care much. Their fence line stopped at my property, or at least I thought it did. That's where I first met Marlene Whitaker, board president. Always dressed like she might step into a real estate brochure at any moment. Pressed slacks, silk blouse, controlled smile. She had that tone that sounds polite but never invites disagreement. When she shook my hand the first time, she looked past me at my barn like she was mentally calculating its resale impact. Blake Carrington handled the operations. Property manager. Younger than Marlene, hair always perfect, smile always a little too smooth. He spoke in phrases like compliance alignment and long-term planning. The first real sign of trouble came when they started digging their retention pond. Massive excavators worked the ridgeline for weeks. Dirt trucks rumbled past my fence from dawn until near dark. I watched from my porch some evenings, beer sweating in my hand, telling myself development was part of growth. Still, I noticed how close they graded to the wall above my pasture. I noticed how the slope seemed steeper than before. After the first heavy rain that year, I saw something new. A narrow ribbon of runoff cutting farther into my field than it ever had. Not flooding. Not damage. Just more water than usual. I drove up to the subdivision gate and asked to speak to someone about it. Blake met me there, friendly as ever. Totally within engineering tolerances, he assured me. Modern drainage actually improves natural flow patterns. Improves for who? I wondered. But it wasn't enough to argue over. The water receded in a day or two. Life went on. Then came the second storm. The runoff widened. A little more sediment. A little more force. I called again. This time, Marlene responded by email, copying Blake and the entire board. She explained that Ridge Hollow had invested heavily in professional hydrology assessments. She used the phrase, best practices, 3 times in 2 paragraphs. The implication was clear. They knew better. I let it go again. Maybe I wanted to believe professionals wouldn't gamble with something as basic as gravity. But I remember sitting in the county planning office months later for an unrelated permit question about my barn roof. 2 developers were talking near the counter. One mentioned Ridge Hollow's drainage modification. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. Small offices don't give you much choice. I heard one phrase that stuck with me. Their permit's still under revision. Under revision. I didn't think much of it at the time. Bureaucracy moves slow. Revisions happen. But the tone wasn't casual. It was concerned. A week later, I noticed fresh concrete work along the retaining wall. From my side, it looked like patchwork repairs. I didn't climb the fence. I didn't assume. I just watched. Then came the week of relentless spring rain, the week that turned my pasture into a basin. Looking back, the signs were there. The grading. The runoff. The careful language in emails. The revision nobody talked about plainly. The morning I found that pipe blasting into my land wasn't the beginning of the problem. It was the moment the problem stopped pretending. And just when I thought they might call, apologize, explain, maybe even admit a mistake, the first official letter from Ridge Hollow Estates arrived in my mailbox. Not an apology. Not an explanation. An accusation. It stated that I was interfering with essential community infrastructure and warned me against any actions that might disrupt approved drainage operations. The morning after that first letter, I drove straight up to the ridge instead of down into my pasture. The rain had eased to a mist, but the pipe was still roaring like it had somewhere important to be. Water blasted from the concrete mouth in a steady, violent stream, cutting deeper into soil that had held firm for decades. Blake Carrington was standing near the retaining wall, hands in his jacket pockets, surveying the runoff like he was admiring a landscaping feature. "We need to talk," I said. He turned slowly, that polished smile already in place. "Mr. Carter, I was hoping we could clear up some misunderstandings." I pointed down the slope. "That pipe wasn't there last month." "It's part of a standard engineering upgrade," he replied smoothly. "Improves flow efficiency and protects the community's retention capacity." "Protects it by dumping it onto me?" "It follows natural drainage patterns." I stared at him. "Did I grant you an easement?" For the first time, the smile tightened. "The water has historically flowed downhill," he said carefully. That wasn't my question. Silence. That pause told me more than any document could. A black SUV rolled up behind him. Marlene Whitaker stepped out, heels sinking slightly into damp gravel but posture unshaken. She approached with the kind of calm that only comes from believing you're untouchable. "Owen," she said, as if we were discussing property values over coffee. "We've invested heavily in proper drainage engineering. 42 families depend on that system working." "And my barn doesn't count?" She folded her arms. "This isn't personal. It's about the greater good. Water has to go somewhere. That somewhere doesn't automatically become my pasture." Blake sighed like I was being unreasonable. "You're looking at this emotionally." "We're looking at it structurally." Marlene's eyes sharpened. "Surely you don't expect an entire community to suffer because you refuse to cooperate." There it was. I wasn't defending my land anymore. I was selfish. One stubborn landowner standing in the way of progress. I looked back down at the water blasting through that pipe and realized something. They didn't think they were stealing. They thought they were reallocating inconvenience. I drove home without another word. By afternoon, the lower half of my pasture looked worse. The grass beneath the standing water had started to yellow, pressed flat under constant saturation. The trench beneath the pipe had widened another foot. Every surge of runoff carried silt toward the barn's foundation. I walked the perimeter with my phone, recording everything. Waterline markings. Soil erosion. Depth near the barn's concrete footers. I moved the horses to higher ground near the paddock. They didn't understand why their grazing space had shrunk. Only that something felt wrong. Animals always know when ground isn't safe. That's when Hank Lawson pulled up. Hank's place borders mine on the east side. Retired farmer. 68. Owns a backhoe he maintains better than most people maintain their trucks. He stepped out, hands on hips, eyes scanning the flooded pasture. "That ain't normal," he muttered. I showed him the pipe. His jaw tightened. "They ask you?" "No." He spat into the mud. "Figures." Hank didn't say much else, but he stood there a long time, studying the angle of the slope, the force of the discharge, the way the water was carving its own path. He understood land the way some men understand engines. "You going to let it stand?" he finally asked. I didn't answer. 2 days later, another certified envelope arrived. This one wasn't polite. It accused me of interfering with essential drainage infrastructure and warned that any attempt to tamper with, obstruct, or alter community runoff systems would result in immediate legal action. They framed their pipe as protected infrastructure. My pasture was apparently the variable. That same evening, the weather forecast shifted again. Another storm system forming west of the county line. More rain. I walked down to the barn just before dusk and crouched near the foundation. The soil was soft enough to sink a screwdriver into without effort. If the erosion undercut the footers, I'd be looking at structural damage. Damage insurance companies love to call flood-related exclusions. I stood up slowly and looked at the ridge above me. Lights glowed warm in Ridge Hollow estates. Lawns trimmed. Windows bright. From up there, my pasture probably looked like an acceptable sacrifice. I went inside and spread every document I had across the kitchen table. Photos. Letters. Property deed. No easement. No signed agreement. Nothing granting them the right to concentrate water onto my land. Another storm was coming, and as I checked the radar map glowing on my phone, I realized something hard and clear. I couldn't wait 2 weeks for a county inspector. Because by then, there might not be a barn left worth inspecting. The second certified letter arrived on a Thursday, thick paper, official tone, signature stamped in blue ink like that made it righteous. I opened it at my kitchen counter while mud still dried on my boots. According to Ridge Hollow Estates, I was obstructing a natural watershed. They accused me of interfering with approved community drainage patterns and warned that any further resistance would result in legal action to protect collective property interests. Natural watershed. I read that phrase 3 times. There was nothing natural about a 4-foot concrete pipe punching through a stone wall. 2 days later, Marlene Whitaker cornered me at the gas station off Highway 17. I'd just finished fueling my truck when her black SUV pulled in beside me like it had tracked my license plate. She stepped out, perfectly composed even in that stiff wind coming down the ridge. "You're escalating this unnecessarily," she said quietly, as if we were discussing a bake sale dispute. "I'm not the one who installed a cannon through my fence line." Her lips tightened. "Residents are reporting pooling near the retention path. Your hostility is affecting 42 families. "My hostility?" I stared at her. "Your pipe is flooding my pasture." She leaned closer, voice dropping. "If you obstruct engineered flow, we will have no choice but to seek an emergency injunction. You cannot sabotage infrastructure that protects this community." There it was again, the reframing. They weren't dumping water, they were protecting homeowners. I wasn't defending land. I was sabotaging infrastructure. By that weekend, word had filtered down from Hank that some Ridge Hollow residents believed I'd illegally blocked drainage, that I was forcing water back toward their homes out of spite. I had never touched their pipe. I hadn't moved a shovel of dirt. But the story had already shifted. They assumed I'd absorb it quietly. They assumed I'd accept being the lowest point in their system, physically and politically. The emotional toll crept in slowly. It wasn't rage. It was vigilance. I stopped sleeping through the night. Every time rain tapped against the roof, I was up checking radar, zooming in on red and yellow bands sweeping across the county. I kept boots by the door and a flashlight on the kitchen counter. One night around 1 in the morning, I stood in a steady downpour measuring water depth against a fence post. marking it with a grease pencil like I was documenting a crime scene. The pipe roared above me. The trench beneath it widened with every surge. The soil near my barn felt softer each day, like something underneath was giving way. The horses had stopped grazing near the lower pasture entirely. Animals don't argue with physics. On Monday morning, I drove back to the county planning office. Denise met me at the counter again, her expression careful. "I pulled every permit tied to Ridge Hollow's drainage modifications," she said quietly. "There's no approved discharge authorization onto your parcel, so they never had legal permission to aim that pipe at me? Not that I can find, but..." She hesitated. "The inspector's schedule is full. Earliest site visit is about 2 weeks. 2 weeks. I felt the weight of that number in my chest. "Is there any temporary order?" I asked. "Not without inspection," she replied. "And if they argue natural flow, it gets complicated." Complicated. Gravity isn't complicated. By Wednesday afternoon, another envelope arrived. This one was sharper in tone. It warned that if I took any action to disrupt drainage operations, the HOA would file for an emergency injunction and pursue damages for community loss. They weren't just dismissing me now. They were threatening to outspend me. That evening, as I drove past the subdivision entrance, I noticed 2 homeowners standing near the walking trail, pointing down the slope toward my land. One shook his head. I couldn't hear them, but I knew the narrative. Stubborn farmer. Causing trouble. Flooding us out. Back at home, thunder rolled again over the hills. Another system forming. The radar showed 3 days of sustained rain beginning Friday. I walked down to the barn before dark and pressed my palm against the concrete foundation. The soil along the lower edge crumbled slightly under pressure. Not catastrophic yet, but close enough to picture worst-case scenarios. I stood there longer than I meant to, listening to water hiss through grass, listening to that pipe above me continue its steady assault. They thought I would just absorb it. Absorb their water. Absorb their legal threats. Absorb their narrative. Because I was one property and they were 42. Because I didn't have a board. Because I didn't have dues. Because I didn't have matching mailboxes and community newsletters. I went back inside, peeled off my wet jacket, and opened the file cabinet in the hallway. I laid my deed flat on the kitchen table. The paper felt heavier than usual. I traced the boundary lines with my finger, following the inked edge where my property met theirs. No easements, no shared drainage agreements, no surrender clauses, just clear lines. Outside, rain began tapping softly against the tin roof, building towards something louder. I stared at that deed for a long time. And I made a decision. I didn't buy this land blind. Before I ever rebuilt my father's barn, before I ever ran horses across that pasture, I spent 12 years in commercial construction, shopping centers, warehouses, multi-acre developments carved out of red clay and rock. I learned early that water is the most patient enemy on any job site. It doesn't argue. It doesn't negotiate. It simply follows slope and finds weakness. I understood grading. I understood runoff calculations. I understood liability. And more importantly, I understood what Ridge Hollow had done. They hadn't just let water flow downhill. They had concentrated it. That pipe wasn't natural dispersion. It was forced discharge. In construction terms, they'd taken a broad sheet of runoff and turned it into a pressure point. And they aimed that pressure at the lowest, cheapest solution available, me. That night, after spreading my deed across the kitchen table, I opened my laptop and started researching Tennessee surface water law. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. Something called the common enemy doctrine. Surface water is considered a common enemy. Landowners have the right to protect their property from it, as long as they don't act maliciously or negligently. You can defend your land. You can redirect water on your own property. What you cannot do is trespass or directly damage someone else's infrastructure. I read that twice. Then I read it again. I didn't need to block their pipe. I didn't need to touch their wall. I just needed to stop being their bull. The next morning, I called the local supply yard and ordered dense clay fill, Not loose topsoil, not sand that washes out, but compactable clay that binds tight when packed. By noon, 2 truckloads were scheduled for delivery. Then I called Hank. He answered on the second ring. "You ready?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "Bring the backhoe." The first dump truck rolled in just after lunch, dropping a mound of thick red clay along the lower stretch of my fence line. Hank arrived 10 minutes later, easing his old backhoe down my gravel drive like he was parking a tractor at church. We didn't talk much. Men like Hank don't need speeches. He climbed into the machine and started shaping earth. The plan was simple. Entirely on my side of the boundary, parallel to the retaining wall, we built a berm. About 2 feet high, wide at the base, sloped gradually so it wouldn't collapse under pressure. Not aggressive. Not dramatic. Just enough elevation to remove the low pocket where Ridge Hollow's discharge had been collecting. The sound of the backhoe bucket scraping and packing clay felt like punctuation. I stood by the fence, watching the pipe continue to spit water while the wall of earth slowly rose in front of it. When the berm reached the outlet zone, we reinforced it carefully. I laid heavy-duty plastic liner against the clay face where the water would strike, then pressed cinder blocks into the outer layer to add weight and eliminate gaps. Every inch remained on my property. I never touched their pipe. I never crossed the fence. I never altered their structure. All I did was reshape my own land. By late afternoon, the berm ran the length of the vulnerable stretch. It didn't look like much from a distance, just a subtle rise in elevation, but to anyone who understood drainage, it was a statement. Hank shut down the engine and climbed down, wiping his hands on his jeans. "That'll hold," he said. "For now," I replied. He nodded toward the ridge. "They ain't gonna like it. They didn't like me asking either." He gave a half smile. "That's because asking cost them money." The sky darkened again that evening. Weather alerts rolled across my phone. Another multi-day system pushing in from the west. Heavy rainfall expected. I walked down to the pasture just before dusk, studying the berm from every angle. The clay was compacted tight. The liner secure. The slope clean. If the water hit it, it would no longer spread across my field. It would stack. It would press. And if it couldn't move forward, physics would force it elsewhere. Back uphill. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. For days, they'd assumed I would simply absorb their problem. That because I had fewer votes and no board meetings, I would quietly surrender acreage to convenience. Now, the equation had changed. That night, rain began slow, light taps against the tin roof, then built into a steady downpour. I stood at the kitchen window watching lightning flicker behind the ridge. I imagined the retention pond filling, water traveling through the underground system, rushing toward that pipe like it had all week. Only this time, there was no bowl waiting. Around midnight, I pulled on boots and walked down with a flashlight. The beam caught the surge as it hit the berm. Water slammed into packed clay and splashed upward in a spray of mist. It searched for weakness. It tested seams, but the liner held. The slope held. Instead of fanning out across my pasture, the runoff began to pool against the wall on the other side. For the first time since that pipe appeared, my lower field remained untouched. I stood in the rain longer than I needed to, listening to the sound of water colliding with something that wouldn't yield. If water wanted to obey gravity, I'd let gravity decide who paid for it. The rain started soft, almost polite. By late afternoon, the clouds rolled in thick over the foothills, low and heavy, pressing the air flat against the ground. The first drops tapped gently against the barn roof, steady but unthreatening. If I hadn't known what sat behind that retaining wall, I might have called it a good soaking rain. I didn't go inside. I stood halfway down the pasture, boots planted in damp soil, watching the pipe. At first, the flow was manageable. A steady stream rushing from the concrete mouth, slamming into the berm and splashing outward in short bursts of spray. The clay held. The liner absorbed the impact. The water churned but didn't spill over. By nightfall, the storm settled in. The kind that doesn't crash and leave, it commits. Rain thickened, drumming harder against metal roofs and gravel drives. Around 10 p.m., the first rumble of thunder rolled across the ridge. By 11, the sky opened. It wasn't rain anymore. It was release. I pulled on my jacket and walked down again with a flashlight cutting through sheets of water. The beam caught the pipe, blasting at full force now, a white, roaring column slamming into packed clay. Water exploded upward and missed before sliding back toward the wall, only this time it didn't spill into my field. It stacked. It gathered. It searched for a path forward and found none. For the first time since that pipe had been installed, my pasture remained untouched beyond the berm's edge. The trench they had carved into my soil stood empty. The grass on my side stayed exposed, rain falling evenly instead of being hammered by concentrated discharge. But behind the wall, I could hear something new, a deeper rush, a heavier volume building pressure. Midnight came with a flash of lightning that illuminated the ridge like daylight. That's when I saw the first porch light flicker in Ridge Hollow Estates. Then another. Then 3 more. Water was backing up. By 1 a.m., I could see headlights moving along the subdivision's internal road. Shapes with flashlights paced near the retention pond. The beam from one cut across the top of the wall and briefly caught the spray on my side. The retention pond had swelled beyond its usual line. Even from below, I could tell. Sometime after 1:30, I heard it. The faint mechanical whine of sump pumps kicking on in unison, a chorus of electric desperation. Water that had once been directed neatly downhill was now searching for somewhere else to go. And this time, that somewhere wasn't my pasture. I stood in the rain longer than I should have, not smiling, not celebrating, just observing. This wasn't revenge. It was correction. Gravity hadn't changed. They had. By 2 a.m., the storm reached its peak. Sheets of water hammered everything. Rooftops, pavement, pasture grass. The pipe continued to fire into the berm, but now the runoff collided with rising resistance on the other side. Pressure met pressure. I walked up closer to the fence and shined my light through the slats. On the Ridge Hollow side, water had pooled several inches deep against the wall. It spread outward across their walking trail, shimmering under lightning flashes. Somewhere uphill, someone shouted. A truck engine revved. Another sump pump kicked on. But my barn, the red boards I had replaced one by one, stood dry. The foundation held firm. The soil around its base remained intact. That was my small victory, not destruction. Protection. Around 3 a.m., the rain eased slightly. The pipe's roar softened. The pooled water behind the wall stabilized, no longer rising as aggressively but far from drained. I went back inside just before dawn, soaked through, boots heavy with mud. I didn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table watching the radar screen glow faintly, tracking the storm system as it drifted east. At 6:30, my phone buzzed. An email from Ridge Hollow Estates. Emergency board meeting, 9 a.m. Subject line, urgent infrastructure disruption. I read it twice. They didn't mention my name directly, but they didn't have to. The tone was clipped, controlled, but underneath it was strain. Something had shifted overnight. The neat little engineering solution they'd imposed had encountered resistance. By 8:30, the rain had tapered to a light drizzle. I stepped outside with coffee in hand and walked back toward the fence. Morning light crept slowly across the ridge, revealing details the storm had hidden in darkness. And that's when I saw something I never expected. Standing water, not just pooling, but stretching in a wide, shallow sheet across their gated walking trail. It glistened in the early sun like a mirror laid across manicured pavement. Their perfect path. Underwater. By 8:55, the gravel at my gate trembled under heavy tires. The first black SUV came in too fast, stopping hard enough to spray damp stones against my fence. The second pulled in behind it. Doors opened almost in unison. Marlene Whitaker stepped out first. She wasn't polished this morning. Her hair was pinned tight, jaw clenched, rain boots replacing her usual heels. Whatever calm she'd practiced before was gone. Blake followed, phone pressed to his ear, pacing already. He looked less composed than I'd ever seen him, glancing back toward the ridge like he expected water to follow him down. You have some nerve, Marlene snapped before she even reached the gate. I stayed where I was, coffee still in my hand. You blocked engineered drainage, Blake said, voice raised. The retention system is compromised. I didn't touch your pipe, I answered evenly. You obstructed flow, Marlene shot back. Basements are flooding. Behind them, more vehicles began lining the road. Homeowners stepped out hesitantly, some in rain jackets, some still in house slippers. They didn't look angry at first. They looked uncertain, scared. A man in his mid-30s pushed forward from the group, face pale. My kid's playroom's taking water, he said, not accusing, just shaken. I met his eyes. Did they tell you where that pipe ends? He hesitated. Marlene cut in sharply. This is not the time for theatrics. It ends in my pasture, I said clearly, loud enough for the small crowd to hear. Has for weeks. Murmurs spread through the gathering. Blake stepped closer to the gate. Remove the berm. Immediately. You're creating backflow. I protected my property, I said, on my side of the fence. You altered natural watershed conditions, Marlene insisted. There's nothing natural about a 4-foot discharge pipe. Her composure cracked. 42 families are dealing with water intrusion because of your stunt. 42 families were fine when it was flooding my barn. That landed. The father who'd spoken earlier looked between us, confusion deepening. A few homeowners exchanged uneasy glances. The narrative they'd been given was thinning. Marlene turned back to me, voice cold. If you don't dismantle that berm right now, we will file for an emergency injunction and request county enforcement. I took a slow sip of coffee before answering. You can go ahead and call them. Blake pulled his phone away from his ear. We already have. So have I. That stopped them. What do you mean? Marlene demanded. I filed a complaint last week about unpermitted concentrated discharge onto my parcel. Her expression didn't shift, but her eyes flickered for just a second. That's absurd, she said quickly. Everything was properly engineered. Then the paperwork should be easy to show. Blake's jaw tightened. You're overplaying your hand. A low rumble sounded behind the gathering of residents. Heads turned. At the far end of my gravel road, just beyond the bend where the sycamores line the ditch, a white county truck rolled into view. It moved slow. Deliberate. The blue county seal on the door caught the morning light. Inspector Daniel Reeves stepped out before the truck had fully stopped. Mid-40s, steady posture, clipboard already tucked under his arm. He didn't rush. He didn't posture. He just surveyed the scene. The homeowners parted instinctively as he approached. Morning, he said evenly. Who's the property owner? I am, I answered. Marlene stepped forward immediately. Inspector, this man has obstructed essential drainage infrastructure and caused significant community damage. Reeves didn't look at her yet. He looked at the retaining wall, at the pipe, at the berm, then at the water pooled along Ridge Hollow's walking trail visible from below. Let's take a look, he said calmly. Blake tried to speak again, but Reeves raised a hand slightly, not aggressively, just enough to signal order. He walked along my fence line first, measuring distance from pipe outlet to boundary marker. He jotted notes. He asked when the pipe had been installed. About 2 weeks ago, I said. Reeves turned to Blake. Permit number? Blake hesitated. It's part of a broader system upgrade. Permit number, Reeves repeated. Marlene crossed her arms. We're finalizing documentation. Reeves nodded once, writing something down. Homeowners leaned in quietly now. The earlier anger had shifted into something else, something cautious. The father spoke again, softer this time. Is it supposed to discharge onto his land? Reeves glanced at him briefly. Concentrated storm discharge onto an adjacent parcel without easement requires authorization. Silence. Marlene straightened, regaining some of her confidence. Inspector, surely you can see the obstruction is the immediate cause of current flooding. Reeves closed his clipboard slowly. I see multiple factors, he said. Marlene's lips curved into a small, confident smile. She looked at me like someone about to win an argument in front of a crowd. He'll see you're the problem, she said quietly, certain. Inspector Daniel Reeves didn't rush. That was the first thing I noticed. While Marlene stood there confident and Blake tried to look composed, Reeves moved with the calm of someone who doesn't answer to neighborhood politics. He walked the length of the retaining wall slowly, boots crunching against damp gravel. He stopped beneath the pipe and crouched, running his fingers along the edge of the concrete sleeve where it punched through stone. He measured the diameter with a small metal tape, called out the number, and wrote it down without commentary. 4 feet wide. Not a trickle. Not natural flow. A system. He stepped back and looked at the berm on my side, then turned his gaze uphill toward the retention pond barely visible above the wall. Permit number for this discharge modification? He asked again, eyes now on Blake. Blake swallowed. It's part of a larger infrastructure enhancement. Our engineers. Permit number? Reeves repeated evenly. Blake glanced at Marlene. Marlene lifted her chin. Documentation is being finalized. The project was professionally designed. Reeves didn't react to the polish in her tone. Was there an easement granted by the adjacent property owner for concentrated discharge? Silence. Homeowners shifted behind them. I could feel it, the subtle cracking of confidence. We followed natural watershed lines, Marlene insisted. Reeves nodded once, then looked directly at the pipe again. Natural dispersion doesn't involve mechanical concentration through a fixed diameter conduit. That sentence hung in the air like a verdict waiting for its period. Blake stepped forward. The obstruction he built created backflow. That's what caused the flooding. Reeves turned slowly toward him. The structure on his side of the boundary is entirely within his parcel? Yes, I answered. Reeves checked the boundary markers himself, pacing the distance carefully. He confirmed the berm's placement, scribbling notes with precise, deliberate strokes. Then he straightened up and faced the small crowd that had gathered. Redirecting concentrated storm discharge onto an adjacent parcel without proper authorization or recorded easement, he said clearly, voice carrying just enough, constitutes a violation. A ripple passed through the homeowners. Someone behind Marlene muttered, "Wait, what?" Marlene stepped forward immediately. "Inspector, you're ignoring the broader picture. We have 42 families relying on that system. We acted in community necessity." Reeves didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Community necessity does not supersede property law, he replied calmly. Engineering solutions must remain within permitted boundaries. Blake tried one more angle. But the obstruction is within his legal right, Reeves finished. The common enemy doctrine allows a landowner to protect their property from surface water, provided they do not trespass or damage another's infrastructure. He has not. I watched Marlene's face shift in stages, disbelief, irritation, calculation. "That's absurd," she said sharply. "We can't be held hostage by one individual." "You are not being held hostage," Reeves answered. "You installed an unapproved discharge outlet. That decision carries responsibility." The father whose basement had flooded stepped closer now, eyes moving between Marlene and the inspector. "You told us it was fully permitted," he said quietly. Blake didn't respond. Reeves closed his clipboard once, then opened it again and began writing with more intention. "I'm issuing an emergency compliance order," he said. "Effective immediately, discharge through this pipe must cease until proper authorization and design correction are completed. Failure to comply will result in daily fines and potential civil enforcement." The words hit harder than shouting ever could. Homeowners began talking over one another now, confused, angry, scared. Someone asked about insurance. Someone else asked how long repairs would take. Marlene tried to regain control. "We will review this internally." Reeves shook his head slightly. "You will correct it." Blake's phone buzzed in his hand. He glanced at the screen and looked physically ill. Up on the ridge, pumps had already started running again, louder this time. Contractors were being called. Emergency measures activated. The same system that had quietly dumped into my pasture now demanded expensive, immediate intervention. The public humiliation wasn't dramatic. There were no sirens, no arrests. Just something far worse for people like Marlene. Exposure. She had stood at my gate hours earlier, certain I would be declared the villain. certain her authority would hold. Now homeowners were staring at her with questions she couldn't smooth over with phrases like greater good. Reeves finished writing, tore off a copy of the notice, and handed it directly to Blake. "Cease discharge," he said. "Correct system. Submit updated plans for review." Then he turned and walked back toward his truck without theatrics. The white county vehicle pulled away slowly, leaving gravel settling in its wake. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the father exhaled sharply. "So this was never legal?" Blake didn't answer. Marlene straightened her jacket and stared past me at the berm like it had personally betrayed her. Up on the ridge, I could see contractors already hauling portable pumps toward the retention pond. Thick hoses snaked across manicured grass, pushing water away from flooded sections of their walking trail. As the pumps roared to life and the reality of correction set in, Marlene avoided my eyes. She wouldn't look at me at all. It took less than a week for the machinery to return. Only this time, it wasn't carving into my land. Contractors tore into Ridge Hollow's walking trail, cutting asphalt in straight, ugly lines to access the underground system. The pipe that had once aimed at my pasture was sawed out section by section. Concrete chipped away from the retaining wall and replaced with solid stone, sealed tight like it had never been breached. By the end of the month, word filtered down that the HOA had approved nearly $200,000 in emergency redesign costs. Engineers were brought back in. The retention basin was rebuilt entirely within their boundary, reinforced with proper overflow controls, and redirected internal piping that looped back into a compliant drainage field. No more shortcuts. No more dumping bowls. Marlene Whitaker lasted exactly one board meeting after the compliance order. Homeowners who had once nodded along at her speeches suddenly had hard questions about professional oversight and financial liability. Within weeks, she was voted out as board president. Blake Carrington resigned shortly after. His smooth phrases didn't carry much weight once paperwork was examined under daylight. The father who had spoken up that morning at my gate walked down my drive one evening as the sun was settling low over the hills. He stood awkwardly by the fence, hands in his pockets. "I didn't know," he said. "We were told it was fully engineered." "I figured," I answered. He nodded toward my pasture. "I'm sorry, it wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be." By midsummer, the grass in my lower field had come back thicker than I expected. The suffocated patches greened up again with reseeding and patience. The trench carved by concentrated discharge slowly softened into the natural slope it had always been. The barn never took a drop inside. On quiet mornings now, I sit on my porch with coffee and watch the fog lift off the pasture like it used to. The ridge above me is still there. Ridge Hollow still stands, but the wall between us is whole again. They believed numbers gave them power. They believed 42 votes outweighed one boundary line. But land doesn't care about votes. Water doesn't care about meetings. Gravity doesn't negotiate. And silence, I learned, is often mistaken for consent. If someone reroutes their problem onto your property, silence becomes permission. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to Fenceline File Stories. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?